Good evening, everyone. I'm Lauren Lake, and I'm back again for another candid conversation with Private School Village. We're so happy you could join us this evening. Tonight's conversation is going to be extremely interesting. We're going to be unpacking the N word. So I want you to sit back and lean into the conversation, understanding that it may be difficult and uncomfortable at times, and yet very necessary in the work that we are doing to empower our community. When we think about the N word, we're going to be discussing things like what should we teach our children? Do we know the history of the word? What's the latest thinking of who gets to use it? How can we better educate our school communities and create ways to protect our children when and if they have an N-word encounter at school? So before we get into the conversation and I introduce our panelists this evening, I want to do a few housekeeping notes. First off, because of the sensitivities around this word and our diverse audience, I just want to be clear, we will not, throughout this broadcast, be using the word itself, but instead be referring to the word as the N word. So I want to make you aware. Next, for those of you that join us often, you know that these events are recorded and a link will be shared after. Also, know that you can ask questions during the discussion using the Q&A feature, but priority will be given to those questions that came in before the event. And then lastly, I want to remind you that the bios of our panelists are in the link that you got when you registered for the panel. And so if you'd like to learn more about the panelists, please see that link because I'm going to present just abbreviated introductions so we can get into the discussion. So first we have Dr. Elizabeth Stordor Pryor, Associate Professor of History at Smith College Sherrod Center, teaching mentor for equitable and inclusive pedagogies, and author, Colored Travelers, Mobility and the Fight for Citizenship Before the Civil War. We also have Dr. Neil A. Lester, Foundation Professor of English and Founding Director of Project Humanities at Arizona State University, a national voice on issues related to the N-word and American race relations. Dr. Lester created and taught the very first undergraduate course on the N-word in this country. Welcome so much to our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm ready to get into it, right? There's no witty way to get into a discussion about the N-word. So we're not even gonna try to make it cute because it ain't. We're gonna get into it because it's real. And that's what we have here at Private School Village, very real conversations, candid conversations. So I'd like to start with you, Dr. Pryor. Can you give us a short history of the N-word?
A short history. Sure. Well, the N-word was a word that is started in enslavement period. You know, the first time the word was used is around 1619 with the arrival of the first enslaved African Americans. And it was initially a word to describe a labor category. You know, they were Black, they were enslaved in perpetuity, and they were in service to others, right? That's what N-word was, sort of like a synonym for the word slave. Over time, I argue that Africans in British North America and the US started using the word as with like political meaning, imbuing it with political meaning. And around the 1820s and 30s, and even earlier, but with the advent of like blackface, minstrelsy, the word sort of gains like a popular momentum because of the popularity of blackface. So the blackface performers tried to authenticate their Blackness by, having raggedy clothes and black makeup on their face and using the N-word. And this use of the N-word was sort of deployed against African Americans, and it became the virulent slur that we know it to be today from that period.
And so if I could just, I want to make sure I'm understanding. So you're saying at first this word did not necessarily have the meaning that we understand today. And please jump in, Dr. Lester. Can you give us some historical examples? You taught the course about how was this ever used, I've heard in an endearing or friendly way at some point, and then how did it evolve? Was it ever endearing, or was it ever a word that had no meaning? Because it sounds like it always had some terrible meaning.
Well, here's my historical take on it, and this is what works for my understanding of the word. And I know that Kendrick Lamar could also give us his take on the history of the word. But as Dr. Pryor has said, that my history notes sort of remind me that it was probably around late 1500s when Portuguese and Spanish encountered Africans, that initial encounter was a descriptor, and the descriptor negro translates to black, but it didn't take very long for one to other in its use of that word, so that black became all those things that are negative that we associate with it today. So clearly by 1619, it had become something that was negative and aligns with the historical perspective that you offered. So I always offer this as a kind of, there was a split moment when there was neutrality, but anytime we other, that othering seems to carry with it some negativity. And in this case, all of those things about blackness, criminal, evil, uneducatable, unintelligent, all those things sort of followed with that category of people assigned that. And the only historical thing that makes sense to me is that was not in its origin something that enslaved people named themselves as, that this was something that was being named as an other. So the term of endearment will have to come up later in the conversation, because I'm still trying to figure out, I missed that memo when we started, calling each other that endearingly, but I'm sure I'll be enlightened tonight.
Well, listen, these are questions, these are questions that have been presented. You are, of course, the expert, so we are looking for you to give our community a greater understanding. I do want to ask, because when you get to the endearing part, and I think that was what the person was trying to get at, the contrast between the negative connotation, and then also, can you give examples of maybe when in our history it has been used and how that can be confusing?
Well, Dr. Pryor, I'm going to pass that over to you, because I have a slightly different take on the sort of endearing part.
Yeah, okay, so the one thing I want to say, if I may, is I think it's really important, and I didn't really amplify it in the way that I should have, that the reason why this word is a slur, when Black people were enslaved and occupied that real labor category, then in some ways you could say they were N-words, right? There was a real labor category that people used that term, and that it didn't have, it really takes on meaning when Black people start to become free, right? When Black people like Frederick Douglass and others find themselves in the North and free, and they're still being referred to in this way and still kind of coming up against the same obstacles that enslaved people. It's like they kind of bought into the idea, okay, well, this is how people that are enslaved are being treated, but when we're free, we're going to be able to have access possibly to everything else that's on offer for people that are supposedly free of our class. We're not property holders, but maybe we'll have this, and the other. But when they found that they were basically free in part in name only, that's when the N-word starts to take hold in a way, because it keeps people in this category that they no longer actually occupy, right? Mm-hmm. They're not doing this kind of labor that was designated as that category, and they're still being referred to, and they still are today. So really, I like to tell students that the word doesn't just come out of slavery, but it's really an indictment of Black freedom. And that's something to keep in mind all the time.
And that's also why I'm still, I continue to wrestle with the term of endearment, just because I'm still trying to figure out. I mean, there are all kinds of ways that we could read that through the lens of Du Bois and double consciousness. There's all this conversation that I hear around young people and some who are not young, who resort to conversations about the spelling of the word, because if we know it's the hard R, we know that's not a term of endearment. But if it's somehow with the GA or the A, then somehow it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
That to me is potentially confusing because it doesn't align with the research that I've done and the ways in which this is not, while language is fluid, there's something way more static about what this term signifies.
Yeah.
So on one level, it doesn't matter what you call me, it matters how you treat me. And if I'm being referred to this and treated this way, then whether it has the hard R, the GA or the A, that's where I am and that's what my lot is as defined. This
is fascinating because I want to get to schools and school policy because I think this is important. I want to move on because I could stay on this forever, but it'll come up later. What are your thoughts about zero tolerance policies in schools? And is this something that is successful when there's a hard line in the sand rule, or should it be handled case by case? Most of the, our audience either have children in private schools, work at private schools, teach at private schools. Please elaborate on that. Either person, whoever wants to pick that up.
I'll start. I'd first have to ask, well, what policies are in place about the use of other kinds of words that are dehumanizing and disparaging? Because there should be consistency if there are policies in place. But I would hope that you can't say the B word or the C word or the F word or any of those other words that are dehumanizing. So I'd want to look at what policies are in place and how are those policies enforced? Because if there's no consistency, what I've heard are these sort of instances which have been considered where Black students can say one thing, but the white students can't say it. And so that gives me pause to sort of apply different rules to different groups based on something that seems not okay in the space of a classroom in an education setting.
The no zero tolerance policies are complicated for me. They really are. And the reason why is I always fear when these are in place, they get deployed against Black students. So that you have teachers and administrators who are less concerned about the fact that they're teaching Huck Finn or they're teaching To Kill a Mockingbird, and the teacher is unapologetically using the N-word without doing deep work and talking about context and history, and then policing Black students in the hallways at school, right? So Black students who are just, that's the time all of a sudden that the N-word matters, is when people are using it in this social context. So I'm always a little wary, but my real feeling is like, I'm a little bit outraged by the question at all, because I feel like it seems to me somebody uses the N-word against somebody at school, it should be clear that is like the kind of like the way the Me Too movement is sort of like rising. We're understanding like it's never okay to kind of like a little bit rape somebody, like it's like never okay to use this kind of language against people at school. And the teachers and the administrators should be behind Black families 100% and supportive, and Black students, and make it like not awkward to report it, and not try to get them to understand what their friends were going through when they said it. I mean, it should just be like, so I guess sometimes when we get kind of caught up here too, I think of the larger social justice issue. Like, it just seems to me like Black kids the N-word will be unimportant to Black kids when social justice is no longer an issue, that there's some way in which the N-word works for young Black people right now. It's doing some kind of important work. And I think it's worth even examining what that important work is. and kind of getting to the bottom of that. So that's my feeling. It's not a straight answer. I think administrators should be instantly outraged and not even need a policy.
Well, and I'd like to sort of toss this in the direction of saying it's not just the students who are using the word. Sometimes the administrators and the teachers are also using it.
Yeah.
There are lots of cases across,
Yep.
whether you're reading it out loud. So I think if we're going to talk about a zero policy, then it has to be applied not only to the students, but also to those who are in positions of authority, who are also using that word in the context of student learning.
And you know what scares me about that, Dr. Lester, and we've talked about this before, is that some of what happens with that zero tolerance is what happens. We're no longer teaching Frederick Douglass. We're no longer teaching, and I actually spoke to a school district in Minnesota that they were no longer teaching some of these central Black texts because they have a zero N-word policy. And the way that they, instead of doing the important work of figuring out how this fits into our canon at our school, they eliminate the text altogether.
Well, my sense is not so much about them not teaching the text, but not fetishizing the text. And we can teach in the same way that we're having this conversation without saying it.
Exactly.
That's where I'm talking about the performance of that text by someone who's in a position of authority, using that as a pedagogy, having people read out loud. That is not saying do away with the text and not teach it. Absolutely not.
So I want to jump in because there is a question from one of our audience members, and I'd love to hear your take. They ask, what are best practices for teaching when the N-word is included as part of a text? For example, particularly in a predominantly white school community and when most teachers are white.
I mean, you go, you take it.
Well, you know,
It's going to be a complicated conversation, so just let's go for it.
The white teachers who reach out to me and administrators, as I just mentioned before, fetishize the word. And so a whole text gets reduced to that word. And no text that I know is reduced to that word. The text is always about something else. There's absolutely no reason to have to say it that I found in the 30 years that I've been teaching African American literature, where I have to say it. I can and have, you know, the last poets, you know, read it, or, you know, Maya Angelou reading, or Toni Morrison reading. That is not the same as, for me, as the authority person in the room saying it, and then saying, well, I'm just reading from this text. So that's what I'm saying. That really is about, which goes back to the policy issue and where these teacher biases are. The teacher bias is bigger than the N-word. It's about suspension and expulsions and all those other things that go with teachers, white teachers who are still, you know, 85% of public schools, white and female. They need to self-examine that stuff. So that's what I'm saying about these texts, is if that's all you're focusing on, then that to me signals that this is about you and not about this text and the students that you're teaching.
Dr. Pryor, I want to get you in on this, but I want to add a layer. I got another question that says, I want to add another layer though. I have a question, and this person writes, I am a white teacher who struggles with wanting to unpack the N-word more as part of my course. However, I don't want to overwhelm my Black students with too much focus on the word for fear of making them more uncomfortable. Any suggestions?
I mean, I do have suggestions. I think Dr. Lester is absolutely right. Like, you can teach an entire, I've never ever said the N-word in my class, ever. I teach minstrelsy, I teach Frederick Douglass, I teach pro-slavery arguments. I have showed 12 Years a Slave in my class. I've never said the word, and I've only had one situation where a student did, and it sort of launched my career into thinking about the N-word pedagogically, because it was such a striking moment, a white student saying it in my class. I think one of the suggestions I would make to that teacher is the conversation does not begin with the text that has the N-word. This is an ongoing conversation, right? So we've already, if we're teaching this book, maybe we don't teach it the first week, but we're teaching it the 8th week of school, and we've spent those 8 weeks talking about you know, race in the US, we've been talking about social justice, we've been talking about, you know, all different kinds of topics, so that it's like by the time it gets there, we already know that our Black student isn't going to be blindsided. Because what I hear from my students, my Black students, is that, and I say this in my TED Talk, and I have a TED Talk if you're interested in looking at this, but that they feel like, one of my students told me, a bobblehead, like all their classmates like boom, 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 like this to them when the N word is said, because all of a sudden everybody wants to know how are they going to react. And I think the important work that teachers can do is taking that pressure off the students by teaching, right? Like a lot of times, if you have kids in high school, I don't know, if you have little kids, maybe this doesn't come up, but if you have kids in high school, like I did, my daughter in the class for Their Eyes Were Watching God, there was like, how do you, Black person, feel about this? We do not make our students teach us this. We as teachers have to be on top of this pedagogically. And right. I am one of those teachers. The best class that I can possibly teach, I say nothing. My students are talking back and forth, but not about the N word, not right. about this. I take charge of this conversation.
Well, but I also see that the teacher who's asking that needs to sort of examine this in a context that is not about the classroom, because that teacher has a relationship with that word and with race that is apart from the classroom. So I keep saying there's a lot of self-work that needs to be done before you approach this text and decide that's what you want to focus on. Because we can see those teacher biases play out, which is why I get these inquiries saying, how do you teach this? Well, how would you teach that? If you're reducing this to a word, then I don't think you're doing a very effective job teaching that. And trust me, we have been talking about this Huckleberry Finn and To Kill a Mockingbird forever. All you got to do is use those fingers and Google what people have said and do some of the work, and not necessarily look for a prescription that the doctor and I can give you that may not work for your students. This depends on the age, this depends on where the students are in their emotional intelligence. But you can also do that with other words, and that's why I try to put the N word within the context of other words that are disparaging and that play out on playgrounds and in classrooms. There has to be some awareness that this word is about dehumanizing, but it's not the only word.
Well, Dr. Lester, you segued right into the next question. And this person asks, there's all this talk about giving and getting a pass to use the word. Should Black people be able to use it as a nod of endearment or camaraderie while whites should not? And does that differ if students are in school versus out of school?
You're directing that at me, or?
I'm directing it at anyone who wants to pick it up, because I
All right, Dr. Pryor, I'll pivot that to you.
Dr. Pryor, what are you thinking?
I mean, yeah, so the pass is a real thing. And I think it's, what I am learning in talking, I've been also, like Dr. Lester, teaching for a couple of years now, a course on the history of the N-word. And what I've learned from my students is that for all students, of really all races in the US, it's sort of a coming of age moment, is deciding, kind of having to make a decision, 12, 13, 14, who are you going to be in relation to this word, right? And sometimes there's even peer pressure around that, like from, you know, Black kids to other Black kids, you know, white kids to other white kids, so on and so forth, right? There's really there's a way in which the word is sort of, I feel like I'm like repeating my TED Talk, but it's like kind of an ultimate taboo, really, in our culture. And so it's tantalizing, it's sexy for kids to kind of try to figure out and navigate and how to engage with it. With that said, I do believe, like I said before, and my work does find evidence as far back as the 1780s of African Americans using the N-word with each other and among each other in a way that defies the words and intent of white racists. So Black people have long, this is evident in, you know, the 1780s, it's in Harriet Jacobs, William Wells Brown, the 1930s WPA slave narratives. It's in Zora Neale Hurston. It's in, then it gets, used by my father, Richard Pryor, in the 1970s NWA, and then of course it is all over hip hop now. So there is a way in which Black communities have long used the N-word that is, I argue, almost a separate word from the word that white people, the particular, and Gloria Naylor writes about this, Ta-Nehisi Coates writes about this. There's a unique way in which Black people use it. And I have no problem with that. That's like fine. I'm not one of those Black people. I went to Harvard Westlake when it was Westlake. I grew up in white neighborhoods in LA. That word is not organic to the environment that I grew up in, and it's silly coming out of my mouth. But with that said, I think that it's important to recognize that there's really a reason, like I was saying earlier, this word does important work for Black people in the US. It really does. And the issue isn't eradicating it from Black speech, but dealing with the social justice issues and working those out so that it no longer has meaning for Black people. So Black people won't want to say it and it won't have that meaning. As far as my son at 13 years old, it was the first time a white person pressured him, begged him, cajoled him to get the pass, right? This is very standard. I hear from Black students that they have a white person, especially in these white schools, predominantly white institutions, that they get pressured by white kids to give them the N-word pass. You have my permission to say it. And sometimes Black people will give it to white people as an honorific. You're so cool, you can say the N-word around me. This is problematic partially because it's little children who are making that decision, that then those white people go on and say, well, back in 1972, when I was 13 years old, I got the pass, so I can still say it, right? That's a problem. And I actually don't think it's really ever possible for a white person to use the N-word in a way that is not oppressive. That is, I just don't think that's ever possible.
And so I want to jump in because a question came up from the audience that speaks directly to what you are saying. And they're asking, so in our schools, how do you think white high school students who use the N-word socially, how should they be disciplined? What should be the consequences? What action should the administration take, right? And when you started, kind of giving this story about a white person begging for the pass, I'm cool, it's just in a song. And I could feel the peer pressure literally. And I have a 10-year-old son and I'm thinking, okay, so this is what's coming, right? But again, how should schools handle this? Because to your point, these are kids, right? And they can't be making the decision in school about which words can be used and what hate speech can have a pass or not. What do you think about that, Dr. Lester? Jump in.
Yeah, but see, I have a slightly different take on that, as we've already talked about earlier. First of all, I appreciate the fact that you mentioned that there's a cool factor here. But I think what's missing from this thus far is this notion that, and I know what Coates says about this as well, but I also take issue with how he has presented this. The example that he gives is about a relationship that people have. And he uses that word about calling my wife baby. That is a relationship. Just because I see you and we have the same skin color doesn't automatically mean we have a relationship. If we have a relationship, we can play the dozens. We can do your mama jokes. That is a relationship. But I know very specifically there are lawsuits that are intraracial between Blacks and Blacks because somebody has used this in the workplace or in a school setting. So this assumption is that yes, within a community where people have relationships, that may be one thing. We can talk about how big my nose is or my feet are, but we don't want anybody outside the family talking about that. What we're talking about is not a relationship. And I can't look at you. I don't want somebody walking up to me and calling me that. In fact, the very first time that I was called the N-word was because a young Black man was upset with me. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to figure out, well, is he using the GA? And yes, he was using the GA. And the other time I saw that were two young Black men who were fighting and kicking each other in the teeth. So, I understand the fluidity of words, but I also understand the ways in which this word has a kind of static sense for me because it represents all these things that have not changed relative to the justice issues that you allude to, Dr. Pryor. So this notion of a pass seems odd to me. It seems odd because when I've seen young people talk about it, it's cool. And that to me is part of this performance of the word. You know, if this is a term of endearment, why can't we find another term that is equally endearing and that you could call your uncle or your sister or your preacher or your Sunday school teacher? So I'm having an issue with the whole sort of this is an endearment. And it is gendered in many ways with you know, boys and men hanging on to this. I want to sort of get at the roots of what is it about that word that is somehow servicing something that these Black people need. But I also saw that when, and I know that you know this, Dr. Pryor, when some of those who were enslaved were sitting around talking about who had the best master. So I still can't move this quite far away from the ways in which we have internalized some of the ways in which the oppressors have talked and thought about us. And I, you know, borrow from Toni Morrison, who says definitions belong to the definers, not to the defined. So trying to figure out how you can take something back that we never owned. So therefore, I don't know how you can give a pass to somebody when it's not anything that you ever own. And if that person leaves that environment where you are, how is that person then going to respond to what's going on? And you say, oh, let me get my pass out. Oh, I got a pass from my friend here. So exactly. All that gets choreographed.
Well, yeah, I think that's falling for, as we say in Detroit, the okie doke, because that pass not gonna work outside of that. Okay, that pass gonna let you write a check that you can't cash.
And sometimes you lose the pass. It's like, wait a minute, I know I had this what do you call that pass when you're going across the toll bridges up there? I know I had this easy pass somewhere.
Oh no, it is not an easy pass, honey. Oh no, but I want to move on because there's so many more great questions.
You know what, Lauren, I feel like I want to kind of address this a little bit longer. I think it's really an important point, and I feel like I was clear, which is that this has no place in the school. White kids who are using this with I think school is like, you know, different geographies have different meanings and different modes of behavior. And when you're in school, you behave in a particular kind of way. And so if we're talking about school, I think it is really important that these very privileged white kids are not given, and I hate to use the word pass because I don't mean it in the same way, but are not given permission to let their sort of fatigue with having to deal. So, you know, it's not their fault that they're white. It's not their fault. And, you know, whiteness isn't really a problem at all. Nobody's saying white people do things. They're saying you're doing something with your privilege against me. This isn't really about a skin thing. It's a way that people enact and empower themselves with that privilege. And too often I've seen kind of this very blasé attitude, especially around young white men. But even you see like on, you know, Snapchat and TikTok and white girls doing hip hop songs and singing, you know, it's like, I feel like, and I'm not saying how the school should deal with TikTok. That's a whole different thing. But I do think on school grounds, the administrators should not think it's cute. They should be outraged. Because essentially what they're saying is they're going back into the roots of Black people are not free. Black people are not the same as me. Black people are different than me. I mean, they are really sending a very important message, and also saying, I know it, and you know they know it, and I don't care.
Right.
You know, and I think that's like, that should not be tolerated.
Well, and one other thing.
I want to get the next question in because it's in line with what you are talking about. And I know you all have so much to say, but I want you to hit these points too as we continue the discussion, because the next question asks, what advice do you have for parents who are trying to arm their Black children with an appropriate way to respond when peers ask for that pass, or when they use the word or they experience an N-word encounter at school? How should they handle that? So we're right here in school now. We know there shouldn't be a pass, but we know kids are asking for that. How do we arm our children with the response? And then, as many of us have, I remember my first N-word encounter. You never forget that. It is forever in your mind, heart, and spirit. You can see the colors, the smell, you can still smell the smells. It is a very real moment in every Black person's life. How do we prepare and arm our children for something that unfortunately, even in 2020, is still inevitable?
Well, I think parents, first of all, need to figure out what their relationship with that word is.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes parents and adults model, even though we're not sure, and we say one thing, do as I say, but not as I do. But I think parents, and I mentioned this with the white teacher, but I think Black parents also need to assert, reflect on how they feel. But back with the past thing, it suggests to me that you own something and that you can give somebody permission to do it. Why is there the assumption that all Black people own that?
Right.
Because we've had all kinds of movements of people, the NAACP tried to bury it. We've had all kinds of, trying to wipe it out of the dictionary. So why is there the assumption that because I look a certain way that I own that and can give you permission when I don't use it myself?
Or permission for me. What about permission for me? Like, if you give the pass, you're giving permission for somebody to walk up and say it to me. Like, and so I think,
Thank you.
I mean, I do think there is some lesson to be had for Black kids, but God, I'm just thinking about, I have a t-shirt that one of my students, a friend of theirs made. It's like, whiteness is exhausting is the t-shirt. And when you just said that, I just was exhausted for 13-year-old Black kids in these schools that actually even have to think of the right thing to say. And it's like, I remember what I said. I was at a bat mitzvah. I was seventh grade at a bat mitzvah. It was like the bat mitzvah after bat mitzvah after bat mitzvah. And I remember telling some white kid, I just wrote about this because I'm writing a memoir about this right now, but I was at the Sportsman's Lodge and I was at a bat mitzvah there. And I told these white kids, you can call me N, the short version, and then the full word. And I remember, I felt like, I think I was like trying to get something out of the way. Like I was trying to just like, in my mind, I was around all these white kids. I'm like, let's just like, let's call it what it is. Like, you can definitely call me that. And I encouraged it. And then I remember waking up the next day and hating myself and hating them. Because it was like such a moment of my own social awkwardness and my own fear of wanting to fit in. How am I going to fit in? I'm going to let these white kids, I'm going to encourage these white kids to call me the N-word. And it's a painful memory for me when I think about it. And I think it's like, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure if I have the right answer, but it's just frustrating to me. I'm angry when I hear that we have to even think of arming our kids against this moment of intense peer pressure to say, like, by the way, you might actually not be cool after this, right? Just know that your friends might not like you after this, because that's the kind of pressure my son was getting.
Well, I mean, as a parent, I know I've had to arm my child with specific instructions, right? Should you be called that, this is what you do. If this happens, you do this. And then when everything is done, you walk directly to the office, you sit down, you say what happened, and you tell them to call my mother. I have had to arm him and prepare him for the moment so that when he's in it, and I'll be very honest about my first experience. My first experience was, well, now I'm gonna jack you up, because, I mean, I'm a baby of 1969. That was when it was still a fighting word. You don't do that. And so I do feel like as parents, we're trying to figure out, how do we arm our children with either something that they should say, do, how they should proceed. And I want to get this question out, and then please keep it going, because they're asking now, like, when and how should parents teach their children about the word? When did you have the talk with your own children? And how do parents, like, how do we know what to say about it when it's being glorified in music, and then they're learning these lyrics, and then we're trying to teach them the real history of the word and not to say it? It is quite complicated to today's generations. Can someone maybe elaborate on that?
Let me just start a little bit by saying one thing that we can do as parents is stop saying sticks and stones may hurt my bone, can hurt your bones, but words can never hurt you. We can stop saying that. We can also stop saying, which is what people used to say back in my day, is, oh, that word just means ignorance and anybody can be ignorant. So we can stop those kinds of nonsensical things. But there are also ways in which this has to be part of larger conversations about race. So we've had that talk because we had to have the talk. The fact that white parents are sort of saying, when can I talk about race, is privilege 101, that you haven't had to talk about it until now. So there's a way in which this should be part of a larger conversation about not just the word, but what does that word signify about you as a person in this country? That's a larger conversation. I don't know that there's like a prescription that I can lay out, but say, when do those conversations about race? That's certainly part of it. My kids, I remember that moment of, Dick Gregory's autobiography. I was sort of like putting it around and trying to decide if I was going to cover up the title of it, because I wasn't quite sure where my older kids were in high school with that. And then I finally said, why am I being nervous about this? And I'm not going to say, oh, if you have a question, come ask me. I'm going to say, let's talk about this. Let's talk about this. Have you been called this? What is it like being in these predominantly white schools as one of, a few brown kids and having this come up? And that opened the conversation. I said, that's hurtful. That's hurtful. And that's when I started writing about it, because I realized that what could happen to my kids had nothing to do with the extent to which I could arm them or prepare them. When they the space, I have no control of what the world is going to do to them.
That was heavy.
Yeah.
That was heavy and very real. It brings me to, the question about schools, right? So how can schools encourage parents, white parents, right, to talk to their children about this word, to be honest about this word? And especially even when some of these people haven't explored their own issues about race in the world, because quite frankly, they've been very privileged not to have to. But the person asked, isn't this a little like sex education, that both the schools and the parents need to play a part?
Yes.
This is exactly what I say in my talk. This is just like, I think the N-word is exactly like sex before sex education. I think it is a perfect parallel, because, I always tell my audiences, like in second grade, I was on the bus driving home from school, and Darlene said, the boys have the eggs. And I was like, I don't think that's right, but like, okay. Like, I feel like that's, but there was nobody to talk to about it, right? I couldn't go up to the teacher and say, Darlene said the boys have the eggs, is that right? Right? And I think it's the same way. It's like, we don't even have vocabulary to speak about this word and ways. And I think it's really important, Dr. Lester, the way you keep, I call it a point of encounter. Anytime you come into this word, there's a real thing that happens. And you talked about it too, Lauren, that there's a real kind of moment. And it's not just in that moment, but we're going back to what happened to us the first time we heard it. We're going back to this moment in high school. Like, this word comes with this heavy history. And I think until people examine that heavy history, they really, don't know exactly how to engage it and how to do this work. I've totally forgotten the question, but I want to say one other thing about how young students can be. One of my students once said to, because we were talking about how this same question, and the student said something so brilliant, a white student, that young people in the United States are taught white supremacy out of the gate, right? Everything they're learning, the blonde Barbie, they are taught white supremacy. So why is it that there even needs to be a time that they're too young to unlearn that white supremacy? That should, right away, we should just be undoing what we're doing. Right. One of the things I know that I did with my kids is I read them a lot of books. I read them, Frederick Douglass's narrative. I read them the Watsons Go to Birmingham. I just read them these books when they were little, so that they had this context. So when this came up, it wasn't news to them. that they were racial beings, that not that just that they were racial beings, but that the white people they knew were also racial beings. And there was a way in which white people were benefiting from that racial identity. Not to say better, worse, anything, but to understand that race is an important social construct in the United States. So that's one of the ways that I think I arm them, and I think kids can learn about that early.
So the question, just to let you know, and I'm going to move on to the next one, the question really was asking, how should white families prepare their children? What do you tell them? What, of course, not to say the word, but I think they're trying to deal with the fact that it is so, pervasive in popular music, some of the hip hop music. And then we're trying to tell them, no, you don't say it all. When you're in the car, you just skip that word and don't sing it. You never say it at school. You never ask a friend for a pass. I don't think white parents know how to dialogue about it, and then they just don't dialogue about it, and then the next thing you know, their child is saying it. And I'm going to lead into my next question because you can cover it all in one. Because what happens is that then they say it, right? The word is being said, and then reporting the incident is a problem, right? Because some kids don't want to be the person that tells, like the whole culture of snitching, right? I don't want to say anything. Or there are a lot of white kids that hear other kids say this word on campus and know it's being said and don't tell, or don't think it's a big deal because the last person that said it didn't get in trouble, didn't get kicked out of school, nothing happened. And so we're creating this, I think that the person is asking, how can we support students in being a part of the solution, right? In kind of eradicating this word from our school communities by telling someone, by being the person that stands up and says, yo, bro, we don't go there. That's racist. That's not cool. I don't want to hear that word. There's not enough of that going on.
Right. Well, but it's also easy for people to say, and I'm borrowing from Maya Angelou, who says, be careful with words because words are things, and you should not allow all kinds of words to be said around you. So again, I'm not assuming that all Black kids, I know some young Black students who don't use the word, who are very conscious, participating in justice work and recognizing that this language is problematic. So if somebody were to walk up to them and ask about a pass or something about this, they would say, hey, that's not even something I use. So don't ask me for a pass. So I want to go back again to this notion that to arm our students and our children is to sort of arm them about race more broadly. The administrators and the teachers have to be educated on a slightly different level, though. It seems like we're having two conversations. One is the white audience, and then the other is what do we do as Black parents? And sometimes those things are not aligned. Right. Because in order to be a Black parent, talking to our kids about race is not necessarily about the N-word. We had to talk about George Floyd. We had to talk about Breonna Taylor. We had to talk about Tamir Rice. That's not about the N-word. That's about what that word represents in terms of people being treated poorly and inhumanely in this country. So this is not in isolation. So when I teach my class, I say, this is about 6 letters, but it really is about something much bigger than that. That to me is the larger conversation, not about whether or not you should say it or not, because we could get into the whole performance of this. Do you write it? Is it with the GA? It's an ER. They're all.
No. I think the question, just to be clear, the question is that we know it's being said. It is being said on school campuses everywhere. And then it becomes, how do we begin to encourage our student community to be a part of the solution, right? And not hear a friend say it, but don't say anything. Hear someone say it or it be a topic of conversation and they don't address the person, and they also don't tell the teacher or administration because they don't want to be the person who tells. How do we begin to do that? Because that's what this person is asking. Go ahead, Dr. Pryor.
So I've got a couple of, I can tell because it's almost 9 o'clock here, my brain's starting to fade. So my apologies that I keep forgetting what we're talking about. But they are saying it, right? They're already saying it. So I think one of the ways that this, a solution to this is talking about it early and often. The idea that you tell your children not to say it, because this is what most of my white students have had. By the time I get them, This is the conversation they've had with their parents. Their parents hear them say it. These are usually white liberal kids, right? Their parents hear them say it, don't say that. And that is the end of the conversation. That's the whole conversation, don't say it. This is why I think it is like sex before sex education. Don't do it, you know, and then we're done, right? But it's not done for kids when they just hear, don't say it. There really needs to be this whole broader conversation about the reason why this word is so powerful here still in 2020, that it was deployed against Barack Obama a lot and had this deep meaning a lot, that he didn't deserve to. Here's a guy who went to Harvard Law School. He doesn't deserve to be in the presidencies because of this word. You know, I think I think that's part of it. And I really think that culture at school is really important for the administrators to, zero tolerance maybe isn't really the right framework, but more like, this disgusts us. Like, you are not cool when you use this. We don't think it's funny when you're singing along. We don't think you're a cool kid. We don't want to, you know, this doesn't like, I'm talking about from the administrators to be like turned off by the kid who does that. But you know what I see happen is a lot of times when kids, white kids, do end up getting in trouble for this, it's the kids who are not cool. So it's like, and this is very similar to sexual harassment too, right? Who were the kids who are always getting in trouble for sexual harassment? Black kids at school. Like, so the kids who are like the most vulnerable are the ones who end up getting in trouble for saying the N-word. So it's a way that it's still not penetrating the culture, and that there are still like white kids that are empowered that are using this word that are not getting any kind of consequences. And I think, I don't know what those consequences are, but I do think people have to start thinking about what they should be in sophisticated ways.
And what are the parents allowing to be played at home relative to this music stuff? So I keep saying there's a way in which parents need to participate in the education on the word too, because I hear a lot of parents who are saying some of the same things that the kids are saying because the kids have heard the parents saying it. So you can't tell the kids to do one thing and you're doing something else. So,
well, and I think for this question though, they're asking when it is said though, right? When it is said, how does the school's policy, you know, influence the way children respond, right? If there is no firm school policy about that this is a zero tolerance, and if you ever hear that word, that student is to be directed to the administration. If there is no clear-cut policy in the schools related to the word, I think that lends itself to a very confusing response amongst the student body as to whether it will be tolerated or not. As if in some instance, if it's funny, if it's an in-word joke. No, there really are no in-word jokes because it's not a joke. But if we don't have firm policy, that's what I think this person is saying. What should the schools do to make sure student bodies understand that this is not something that should just be part of the framework of student life?
Well, I think conversations right at the beginning of the school year. I mean, this is what I do. My first day of class, I say, hey, we're going to be doing a lot of this really deep work about slavery and stuff. We're never saying the word in this class. And here's why. I know it's imperfect. I know it seems like censorship, but here's why we're never going to say it. And we're really lucky because Black activists in the 1980s and 1990s gave us this wonderful surrogate phrase. It's called the N-word. It's a surrogate phrase. They worked hard to get this into the vocabulary. We all know what we're talking about, and therefore we can go ahead and do whatever we need to do without saying it on campus. Now, maybe that's not the same thing as what they're listening to in their cars when they pull up to school and all that kind of stuff. But what I think administrators should be concerned about is on the campus setting the tone right from the start. Like the same way you wouldn't let one student walk up to another student and punch them in the face, right? You wouldn't let them do that. You'd be really clear that that was off limits. Why get murky about this word that so clearly is a touching point throughout, in US society? I don't know.
But again, if we put that in the same boat as we talk about other harassment, then I don't know why this is somehow alien from other policies. I would hope that bullying That's not far from what administrators have to deal with. Be consistent in how we apply that. But that's a deeper issue because those who are administrators have their own biases toward this. I know a situation where a Black student at a charter school, mostly white, was called the N-word, and the teachers and the administrators said, oh, the kids were joking.
Exactly.
So this is not about the kids, this is about the administrators and the teachers who are making, which is why I kept saying, the white teachers teaching those texts need to figure out what is their relationship with that word before they try to go into a classroom teaching it. And what is their relationship with race and with justice and with all the other things, the suspensions, the expulsions. What's the leadership looking like? I mean, these are bigger issues than a single kind of, here's a strategy, a prescription that's going to take care of that.
You know what drives me nuts about this is like, I've heard many white teachers say, well, I had this Black student, brilliant Black student in my AP class, and he said it was fine. I was like, we are not letting 17-year-old children, we're not letting 13-year-old children make the decision about this. We're adults, and we're going to come in and we're going to be in charge of our classroom. And if you're a white teacher, part of the work that I do, I'm writing a memoir about this right now. Part of the work I do is I'm uncomfortable and awkward and weird around this.
Right.
Like, and that's okay if you're a white teacher and you come in and you say, I'm uncomfortable, I'm awkward, and I'm weird about this. I'm weird. You can say that.
Well, and have the students engage in some of the research. Now that has to be structured, but there's a way in which there are things out there that students appropriately can look at. There are books to read. There are ways in which we could talk about those Disney tunes that are minstrel songs that have the word in it. And the students can be part of the discovery instead of imagining that teachers have to have the answers to all of this. But the teacher has to have done some of that work to begin with, though.
So we have a lot of people asking a very similar question, and I want to kind of paraphrase so we can get your thoughts, because it's almost 6 o'clock. Time literally flew by. A lot of people are asking, what do you say to white kids who are listening to rap music that has the N-word in it, along with Black friends, and they're just enjoying the music? As a parent, what do you suggest we tell our white kids? We need to understand, we need to have them understand that it's not an option to use it at any point when listening to the music, but how do we make them understand that? A lot of our audience is basically needing to understand this whole issue with the music, and when the word comes and you sing in the music and you do, what do you do when you're white?
Well, there are lots of things that we as adults have to do that we don't understand. And sometimes a rule is a rule, and there are consequences to that rule. We have to accept what it is that we don't understand. And again, I ask that we not just look at what that word is in the rap song, but what else is that rap song or that song about? There's often misogyny, there may be homophobia. What else is in there? Where's the context for that? And what is there about that word that we feel that we have to say it? I mean, why is it controlling you instead of you controlling what's coming out of your mouth?
I mean, I think too, I love that. And I think a little guilt and shame can go far away. Like just being like, you do know that participating in this, you are that white person. You're the white person. You're doing white supremacy right now. You're doing minstrel performance. You're doing blackface. This is exactly what you're doing. This is not, this is what you're engaging in right now, like kind of letting them know, like you're not just as cool as the Black people when you're doing this, but there's this particular kind of thing. And if you want to support and show your love for Black culture, you be that white person like Eminem, right? Who doesn't use the N-word in his music, right? But he's an incredibly well-respected hip hop artist. So that if you want to be that kind of person in relation to Black culture, and that's who you think you are, you absolutely would not use the word. Because that's, no matter what some of the hip hop artists say, whatever, this is the historical reality, right? Those people are often very kids themselves who are giving those answers. But the depth of truth is if you want to be a person who cares about Black culture and is interested in social justice, you are not going to participate in this way. And you're going to understand that just because something's for consumption, it doesn't mean that you are meant to be the consumer and use it in this way. And that's okay. That's okay. Something is, an artistic endeavor is created and it's not explicitly meant for you. That's okay.
Well, and I'll also say that Black people have to realize that Black people also blackened our own faces in the minstrel tradition also. So Bert Williams and others, and we can look at various forms of minstrelsy today with Steve Harvey and Kevin Hart. So I often ask Black people to self-examine and self-reflect on what we are contributing to that conversation, and not just always have this about the white gaze.
I want to, goodness, ask our last question. I don't want it to be over. I'm learning so much, but I want to ask our last question. Last question is, where do we go from here? If there are parents, teachers, and administrators who want to continue to have this discussion so that they can assess or strengthen their own school policies, or just have opportunities to grow and learn more, can you please provide some good resources and places that they could tap into to learn more and continue this very, it's an uncomfortable conversation, but very necessary.
Well, I'll just say at the outset, one of the sources that I've contributed to that I feel is quality, it's K through 12, is Teaching Tolerance from the Southern Poverty Law Center. There's lots of stuff, and trust me, the questions that we're asking here are not questions that have been asked for the first time about this word. So go look at the stuff that's already been done. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And often educators are talking about what worked and what didn't work. So I would suggest that. I've got my own stuff that I've set out there that you can Google. There's no TED Talk, but there's certainly a lot of interviews, and it's only a perspective. And I think if we can engage a critical lens, and we can decide what makes sense for us and what works best for us in terms of parenting our own children.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, I go to my talk. I love an article by Emily Bernard called Teaching the N-Word, a white teacher, a Black teacher, a white classroom, and the word nobody wants to say. Although she comes in differently than me, I think it really just shows the difficulties of trying to do this kind of work. There is a lot of really good stuff out there that people can read, but I think because the N-word isn't really a word, it's really an ideology. I think you could really read any of these important books about, you know, white supremacy and about Black history, that, you know, like, you know, so you want to talk about race, white fragility. I just think there's a lot of different kinds of work out there. I just read Eloquent Rage by Brittany Cooper, beautiful, brilliant. I just think there's a lot of, if any of this reading on Black culture will help inform this kind of discussion.
Yeah. As one of your other guests says, there's 400 years worth of content out there written from the Black hand side, okay?
Listen, I cannot thank you both enough, Dr. Lester, Dr. Pryor, for giving us this hour. I have learned so much. And Dr. Lester, you were referring to Dr. Jamila Liscott from Tuesday night's Candid Conversation about the power of language and the way it shapes identity. And I think this was a perfect way to continue that dialogue, because language is powerful and it does shape identity. And when we're using the wrong language, right, it can shape our identity in the wrong ways. And so this word has had so much power for, like they said, 400 years, right? We're still unpacking it. Right. And I think the most important thing I got out of this discussion is that we are each responsible. That so many of the questions that we were asking, they're discussions, reference, they're all in the reading and in the understanding, and it's up to us to have the desire, the commitment, the intention to do the work, right? And then to inform and educate our children, or even encourage them to do the same, to research, to learn, and
guided research.
Understand. And so that's what I got out of it. And as much as I try to teach my son, I've listened tonight and I've said, listen, I want more of these resources. I want to learn more. I want to unpack more. And I hope our audience feels the same. We thank you so much for sharing this hour with us. To all of you who are listening, we had such a huge group tonight. I want to give another special thanks to Lisa Johnson and the Private School Village for being willing to host these very important discussions. I always say uncomfortable conversations are really the most powerful, the ones where we just don't always have all the answers, right? And everybody might not get along when it's over, but that's all right, right? Because it's about learning and it's about growing, right? And creating a better world for our children, and also helping to reshape the school communities that, you know, in many ways help shape our children's identities each day. So thank you so much for allowing us the opportunity to learn more from you. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us. We will see you soon. I believe we have another great conversation coming up on Tuesday. So please go to the Private School Village website to find out more, and have an absolutely wonderful August the 4th. Lisa just got me the information. August the 4th, yet another wonderful conversation coming up. So be on the lookout for that. And please register, support this amazing organization, Private School Village. We thank you so much for joining us this evening. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.